Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on Thursday, the 28th of April. I'm Kate Andrews, the Spectator's economics editor, and your host this week. On this week's show, a Tory MP has been accused of watching pornography in the House of Commons. It comes as another Tory said that Angela Rayner was trying to distract Boris Johnson at PMQs by crossing and uncrossing her legs. James Forsyth, the Spectator's political editor, and Katy Balls, our deputy political editor, will join me to discuss the culture of the Commons. Douglas Murray writes this week's cover piece, Fractured. He says that Western culture is under its most serious attack since the Cold War, with a woke minority, quote, destroying ties that bind the West. He'll discuss it with Fraser Nelson. Elon Musk has bought Twitter this week for $44 billion. Fraser in this week's magazine asks whether having the world's richest man in charge of the social media site could make it the home of free speech on the internet. He'll join the show with Suzanne Nossel. Florida Governor Jon DeSantis has been picking a fight with Disney after they oppose his now dubbed Don't Say Gay bill. Did he go too far? Is he tapping into what voters want? Is it both? Freddy will join the show alongside Charlie Cooke. And finally, I went on a course at the London Zoo to overcome my severe arachnophobia, and I'm delighted to say it worked. I'll be joined by Dave Clarke, who led the program, to explain how he did it. But before we get going, a quick reminder to subscribe to The Spectator. You can get 12 issues of the magazine for just £12, and we'll even give you a free £20 Amazon voucher too. You can find the offer at spectator.co.uk/TV offer. And why not subscribe to our YouTube channel too? Click the red subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. A Conservative MP has been accused of watching porn in the House of Commons. It emerged yesterday. At the weekend, too, another Tory commented that Angela Rayner, Labour's deputy leader, was crossing and uncrossing her legs to distract the Prime Minister at PMQs. What's going wrong in the Commons? To discuss, I'm joined by James Forsyth, our political editor, and Katy Balls, our deputy political editor. Katy, James, thanks for joining me on Spectator TV. Katy, first, I want to start on the most recent story that an MP has been accused of watching pornography in the House of Commons. It sounds pretty shocking. Can you tell us what's happened and explain what the fallout has been?
Yes, this came from a meeting where MPs were discussing sexism in politics, and MPs started sharing stories, and that story included an MP saying that they had once seen their colleague watching porn in the Commons chamber. Now, when this first started to emerge, there was some online saying this is a frontbencher. Ultimately, we don't know who it is, but I think since that was aired, the sense is that this is a Tory MP. It's not being suggested this is someone who does hold a government role. But the question is now, who is doing that? And we're hearing that obviously the chief whip is keen to investigate this. You are hearing from senior Conservatives that whoever has done this ought to be punished. But the question is, are we actually going to find out who it is? And I think unless those people who come forward who are discussing this more in an anonymous way of describing their experience of sexism in Parliament, unless they want to come out and specifically name them, it's very hard to take this on further.
James, how serious of an offence would this be seen to be?
I think it is very serious. I think watching pornography in the workplace is clearly wrong, but I think to watch it in the Commons chamber is such an affront. This is the cockpit of our democracy, that it's such an act of disrespect. And I think it's also it's such a kind of voyeuristic act, because you would know, because of the way the Commons chamber is set up, that other people might see what you are watching, that it's kind of almost also an act of intimidation at the same time, as well as being pathetic. And so I think it's very, very hard to see how whoever was doing this could remain either in the Conservative Parliamentary Party or, frankly, as an MP at all.
Katy, this comes after the Mail on Sunday reported at the weekend that a Tory MP was saying that Labour's deputy leader Angela Rayner was deliberately crossing and uncrossing her legs in an attempt to, quote, distract Boris Johnson at PMQs. The comments have been widely condemned. How bad is all of this for the Conservative Party and their image?
So I think it's a wider issue which has been happening in recent months. And if you look at Tory MPs, backbench MPs, there have been a spate of stories which have suggested Tories behaving badly, whether that is a conviction or, for example, in the recent case of an MP where they were caught and what they claim was a sting, but ultimately taking cocaine and also propositioning parliamentary staffers. And I think that therefore this is building up, and you're seeing the opposition try to say this too, into almost a sleazes back narrative. And I have to say, I've heard members of the 2019 intake say that they are worried that it is getting back to almost the major years in terms of that sleaze and how it looks to the outside world.
James, this is the return of Pestminster.
Yeah, I think it is Me Too too, as someone said to me yesterday. I think there's also another thing going on here, which is Parliament is back to normal in terms of a social side, really, for the first time since COVID. And I was talking to one kind of long-standing Tory MP. He's long taken a kind of pastoral interest in his colleagues. And he was saying that one of the mistakes that's been made, he thinks, is that no one has taken aside the new intake of MPs to say, look, there is lots, the weather's getting better, people are back in Westminster, the terrace is open, but take it easy. It's not healthy to be out there every night drinking heavily. And that no one has taken these people aside, and they argue that the terrace is what caused this whole Angela Rayner story, which was obviously crass in the extreme and bad manners. And I think this is a worry. I think the worry that among Tories is that this kind of Japanese knotweed of sleaze is back, and now every story that comes out is seen through this. Now, I think it's also worth saying that there's an accusation about things that a member of the shadow cabinet has said. That this problem is not confined to one party, but I think it really does risk for the Tories feeling like a kind of sense of decay akin to 92 to 97.
James, let's turn to your politics column this week for the magazine. You write that after months of good relations between the EU and the UK, things could soon turn rocky again. Give us the details.
Yeah, so I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine reminded the UK and the EU of the need for the kind of world's democracies to work together, that ultimately they were strategic allies and partners rather than rivals. I think what is going to make things rocky is that in the Queen's speech, Boris Johnson intends to propose to legislate to protect the Good Friday Agreement in its entirety. What this is code for is essentially the UK unilaterally overriding parts of the Northern Ireland Protocol if it can't reach an agreement with the EU. Now, this is a kind of classic Boris Johnson negotiating tactic with the EU. He puts a threat on the table, think back to the internal market bill, and sees whether that gets the EU to move its position. I think the UK government feels frustrated that at the moment all the EU will do is have a kind of technical negotiation with it on the Northern Ireland Protocol on the basis that the UK signed this document just a couple of years ago, while the UK wants a more fundamental negotiation about the nature of the protocol. I think that some in the UK government think that the best chance for progress is that, there is this whole question of how are you going to get the devolved institutions in Northern Ireland back up and running after the May elections. I think that's particularly the case if Sinn Féin are the largest party and get to nominate a First Minister. I think the DUP would not be keen to serve in an executive where there is a Sinn Féin First Minister, to put it mildly. And so I think some in the UK government argue that, only by addressing unionist concerns about the protocol can you really put pressure on the DUP to go into the executive and get the institutions back up and running.
And Katy, finally, you have written about Foreign Secretary Liz Truss's Mansion speech this week. The Foreign Secretary said that Russia needs to be pushed out of, quote, the whole of Ukraine. And this comes after Russia has sanctioned 287 MPs. Can you talk us through Truss's thinking?
Yes, so this was the Foreign Secretary's big keynote to set out her vision for foreign policy. And I think you can look at it in two ways. So there's the immediate and then there's the more long term. So in terms of Ukraine, I think as you've just touched on, it was another ramping up of the rhetoric when it comes to Russia. And I think we're far past the point now where where we were a few weeks ago, where there was still some in government who would talk about potential peace talks. And Liz Truss making the point that Russia needs to leave all of Ukraine. The Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, backing her up this morning on the media round. And when it was put to him, does that involve, places that Russia went to before this year, so outside of the most recent full-scale invasion, so Crimea and others, then it would suggest that is the position. Now this suggests, and it seems, and I think the Foreign Secretary's expectation is that we're heading for potentially a very long war in Ukraine, some talk, 5-10 years, where would this end? And there is no easy end in sight right now. And I think more generally in terms of what Liz Truss wants to do in terms of UK foreign policy is actually bring more of an economic underpinning to it. So we saw in the integrated review that Russia was correctly identified as the most hostile, and then China was also named as a country that you would have to grapple with. But then to now, in order to bring other countries into the UK's orbit, into the orbit of the West, this effort to do that free trade, and also doing that with countries that don't necessarily fall into the definition of a liberal democracy. So you don't work with aggressors. That's where, in this carrot and stick approach, the stick comes through sanctions, but actually a carrot for those countries which are not currently key allies, but had the potential, and by bringing them in, you also deprive the aggressors of working with them, is what they are hoping to do.
Katy, James, thanks for joining me. In this week's cover story, Douglas Murray asks whether or not the West can fix itself. Why should the West, he says, act so ashamed? Douglas spoke to Fraser Nelson yesterday.
Douglas, in your cover story and in your book, you talk about a war on the West. What kind of shape is that war taking?
In my view, what's happening is a vicious, unrelenting, remorseless attack on everything that constitutes the West as we know it. The West's history, the peoples of the West, the culture of the West, all the institutions of the West, the traditions of the West. And this has been growing for quite a long time now. You could argue it's been growing for the best part of at least half a century. And then it has sped up massively in the last few years. And as I say in my cover story in The Spectator this week, one of the most visible things is this war on the history of the West, the war on the history of a country like Britain, so that every single one of our institutions, from Kew Gardens to the National Trust, to the Tate, to the British Library, to the Globe Theatre, all the things that are meant to be effectively custodians of our history have actually started to wage a war on that history, so that they present our history as if there's just nothing good about it. And as I say in my cover piece, one of the many devastating things about this is that a country and a culture and a society can only be held together if, first of all, it has some agreement on its past, and secondly, it thinks that past is broadly good. Because if you don't think you were good in the past, why would you do anything in the present?
Right. But is this so much different to what we had during the Cold War, for example? I mean, America was hugely divided. I remember seeing some figures recently about how many domestic bombings there were in America in a typical year in the 1960s. In Britain, you had full-on communist parties. In America, you had communist parties in Britain who were making absolutely devastating critiques. Well, not very effective, but they were, very much at war with capitalism, with the basics of democracy.
They were.
Is it really?
Yes, they were.
But now we've just got a few students pulling down statues. I mean, is it really worse?
Well, it started with students, and as Andrew Sullivan famously said, it spilt out, and now we all live on campus. It's now gone through every corporation, every government department. It isn't just a few students anymore. There was a time when you could argue that it was, but the students left university and they went right out into the marketplace, and they had jobs to go to. One of the jokes on conservatives in recent years was that conservatives often joked in the last generation, these people doing these ridiculous degrees, they're going to go out into the real world, they'll discover there aren't any jobs for them, the market will assert itself. Flat out wrong. The joke was on us. There were plenty of jobs for these people to go into. They went into HR departments. They went into the civil service. They were the ones who passed the civil service's demand that for any public appointment, any civil service appointment, you have to demonstrate a belief in and devotion to diversity, inclusion, equity, all things which are in their fundamentals, as I say in the piece, anti-Western. You cannot dedicate yourself to this new pseudo-ideological, pseudo-religion, because in part, everything about it is against the institutions and the history of what the country used to believe in until yesterday. So, the big difference between now and the Cold War was, first of all, in the Cold War, there was some unity because there was some recognition of a shared foe. But secondly, there were still adults. there were still adults in the room, willing to stand up for traditions, willing to stand up for history, willing to say that actually we have virtues as a country and not just vices, virtues as a people, not just vices, things that we did well in our history, not just things we did ill. And today, look around the public square. All of the adults fled the scene. Every corporation in Britain, every government department, every publishing house, everybody sees the same thing. The people you describe as the sort of highly ideological students make all of the running, the shouting, the desecration of the past, and the adults give in. Effectively, what we are living through now in Britain and in the wider West is a cultural revolution. And it's a cultural revolution where the adults have been intimidated into either silence or going along with it.
But Douglas, you say there wasn't a common enemy in the Cold War, but we're getting one now, aren't we? Since Putin's invasion of Ukraine, there has been a strikingly coherent and, as far as I can work out, spontaneous response from Europe and America and beyond into presenting a united front against him.
Well, it's a very important point you just made. The Russian invasion of Ukraine seems to some extent to have fortified certain people. It seems to have clarified the minds of some people. It's answered the 30-year-old question that we all asked of whither NATO? What's the point of NATO? That question isn't being asked anymore. And when Sweden and other countries join NATO later this year, that will be a very interesting answer in itself. But here is the problem. It's not just Putin's Russia in the 21st century that poses a threat. A far bigger threat, a far bigger challenge in the 21st century is China, the Communist Party of China, which, as I mentioned in the book, is the only country in the world. Putin's Russia is a basket case. It was even before this war, especially is after it. The only country in the 21st century likely to catch up with and then supersede America and the Western nations as the global power, the most important economy in the world, is China, led by the Chinese Communist Party. And that pumps out anti-Western propaganda all the time. Just this past week, the China Daily News, one of the organs of the Chinese Communist Party, pumped out a vision of Uncle Sam behind the Oval Office desk and a pile of corpses, and said that America is all about racism and so on. And there's 2 points to make here. The first is, of course, this is totally cynical. I mean, ask any of the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang whether the Chinese Communist Party actually minds about family separations or racism, and you'd get an answer. But secondly, the problem that exists now is not Chinese anti-Westernism or Russian anti-Westernism or Middle Eastern anti-Westernism. It is Western anti-Westernism. It is white people doing this against white people. It is white people deciding that our history is all a history of racism and that we're racist now and institutionally racist now, and somehow Derek Chauvin, who was convicted of the killing of George Floyd, is the emblematic figure of the West. And this isn't a fringe thing. You know, no less a figure than the US ambassador to the UN went to the UN last year and condemned her own country for institutional racism, something which, by the way, the Chinese Communist Party's envoy to the UN found incredibly useful when he stood up to make his remarks and said, this is the first time that a country has come to the United Nations and confessed its guilt. So the problem is not the external challenge. The problem is the internal one. The problem is people in the West who've been taught to think horribly about the West, so that our history is only a history of repression and slavery and colonialism. Our history is uniquely bad, not uniquely good. And here's the most important point in a way, and it's something I bring across not just in the book, but in my piece for Spectator this week. We have evidence for the fact that this is flat out wrong. How do we know? Because the footfall proves it. The UN published another study just in the last year, asking people around the world fleeing not just conflict, but economic deprivation, where do you want to go? What are your destinations? People do not flee to Putin's Russia. They do not flee to Venezuela. They do not flee to communist China. The number one destination that people around the world want to go to is the United States of America, and Britain and Canada and others follow shortly afterwards. Now, that says something. It says that whilst our society is being told we have nothing to be proud of, the world wants to come here. That whilst we are being told we live in a racist society, and a bewildering array of people want to come here. And here's the important thing about that. It's not just in the present. Our present is not as it is by accident. It's come about because of our past. If there's something good in our present, it's because we must have done something good in the past. And that's what I want people to realize and to be able to focus on. If we are to unite as a country, as a civilization, as a culture, we need to recognize not just that we've done some things well, but we've done more things well than anybody else. And it's proved in the footfall of the people who want to come here.
And one final thing, Douglas, isn't everything we do well arguing with each other? I mean, you talk about these divisions and this huge cantankerousness, but isn't that the sign of a West succeeding? I mean, there isn't much war institutions in North Korea right now. There's not much in the way of public debate. Right. Wouldn't you expect a successful, thriving West to be absolutely at loggerheads over culture, music, history, the whole gamut?
Absolutely. And as I say in the book, I absolutely encourage that. I want to shut down no debate. But currently, we have had an entirely one-sided debate in recent years. There was a time when the debate was one-sided in the opposite direction. A few generations ago, if you were taught about colonialism in British schools, you were taught only the good things. A few generations ago, if you studied American history, you might not have known that Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. Today, it's the only thing people know about the founding fathers in America. So here's the thing. I want there to be a rigorous debate. I want there to be a thriving debate, but I do not want it to be one-sided. And the people who have been attacking white people in recent years and been saying racist things about white people have been a one-sided, monotone discussion, and they've got away with it for too long. The people who've attacked our culture and all of our heroes, from Winston Churchill to Lord Nelson, these people have been doing a one-sided attack on our history. I believe that the British public and the wider Western public have the right to have a more honest appraisal of ourselves and our past. And that includes the right to have pride in our past, because as it happens, it's not just vital for a society to hold together, but the facts just happen to be on our side.
Douglas, thank you for your appraisal and for your cover story in this week's magazine.
And Fraser joins me on the show now to talk about Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter. The Tesla CEO made the $44 billion move earlier this week, saying he wanted to restore freedom of speech to the platform. Could his plan work? And our government's going to try to stop him. Fraser writes about it in this week's magazine, and joining us is Suzanne Nossel, CEO of PEN America, an organization founded to defend and celebrate free expression. Fraser, you write for this week's magazine about Elon Musk's $44 billion purchase of Twitter and what it means for broader public policy in the UK. We will get on to that point, but first, what did you make of Musk's decision to buy the social media company?
I thought it was incredible, as is much that Elon Musk does. You can't make much of a business case spending that much money on Twitter. It's only made profit 2 out of the last 10 years. It's really struggled to find much of a future since it joined the stock market. I think its shares have been bought for pretty much the same price they were floated at all those years ago. But then again, Elon Musk is worth $250 billion. Somebody like him has got the $44 billion to spend on what he regards as not an economic, not a business case, but on, he says, a defense of free speech. Now, if that's what he means, then great, because free speech needs a deep-pocketed champion right now. And what has been happening is that the governments not just in Britain, but in the European Union and other parts of the world, have been trying to suborn free speech by putting commercial incentives in front of social media companies which have been following those incentives. So everything that you see, from the conversation we're having right now on YouTube to articles you may or may not come across on Facebook and Twitter, go through some kind of vetting process, an invisible vetting process. And more people should know about it, they don't. But Elon Musk is the one saying he's had enough of this. He wants to go public on the algorithms used to promote or to cover up conversations and social media posts, and to bring a more democratic approach to Twitter. I've got no idea exactly what he means. I don't think anybody else does either, but it's going to be very interesting to watch.
Suzanne, what do you make of his decision to buy Twitter?
It's hard to know whether this is a kind of an ego play, that he's been frustrated with the platform and, thinks he could do a better job, wants to amplify his own voice and influence as a cultural figure. That seems to be part of it. He's certainly someone filled with a lot of bravado. I think we take him at his word in terms of being frustrated with some of the constraints, the way a platform like Twitter operates. If he thinks that the answer is simply sweeping away the rules wholesale, I think he is in for some really tough lessons. It depends in part what you really mean by free speech. Is free speech just the ability of anybody anywhere with any motivation and purpose to write whatever they want on a platform like Twitter? Because if so, we will find ourselves with a public square, as Musk puts it, that is just overridden with harassment, with trolling, with doxing, with disinformation, hoaxes, hucksterism, conspiracy theories, all of the things that drive people away from social media and that detract from the ability to engage in reasoned discourse. And so I think what he's going to find is the struggles that a platform like Twitter has had in terms of where to strike the balance with removing harmful content, trying to create space for meaningful and constructive and enlightening and engaging conversation, trying to attract eyeballs, generate revenue. All of that is going to persist into a Musk era. I just don't see how he avoids that.
Fraser, on Wednesday, Musk tweeted, "By free speech, I simply mean that which matches the law. I'm against censorship that goes far beyond the law." One could argue that even there, you're starting to get little glimpses at a climb down that goes far beyond the law, for example. And what do you make of Suzanne's point that if he were to actually implement something that allowed for far more hate speech, for example, for far more pile-ons, for far more aggressive language, that he may actually come to regret it?
Well, I think he is in for a difficult decision. Of course, you've got to draw the line somewhere. And there have been rivals to Twitter, Parler and things like that. And those rivals have tended to find out pretty quickly that it's not a great look when you get genuine racists and bigots spouting their hatred on these forums. Nobody really wants to be part of that. So, of course, you need to cut out things that are perfectly lawful. Pornography, for example, is perfectly lawful. Elon Musk won't be having that on Twitter. Of course, you will draw the line. But when you do draw the line, you start to get flack. You need to defend to the death, for example, somebody's right to say something which you absolutely disagree with. And that can be a difficult position. Will a tech billionaire like Musk be particularly willing to spend his time and energy fighting these pretty squalid battles, as they are most of the time? That's, I think, what we need to find out. But his distinction, saying that he's against censoring anything which is legal, brought me to thinking about the UK government's plan, because it wants to do is to create a whole category of things that are legal, perfectly legal, but still harmful, whatever harmful means, and make sure social media companies will censor that. Now, this, I think, poses a grave risk to freedom of speech in Britain. If you say to social media companies and tell people like Elon Musk, we want you to censor things that are perfectly legal, but we might regard them as harmful. And by the way, if you get this wrong, we're going to fine you up to 10% of your global revenue. That's billions of dollars. So it would take somebody of Elon Musk's character to run that risk, to say, you know what, I'm going to let people say what they like about the government. And if that means I fall foul of a regulator, then so be it. Because most companies, if they're running their company for profit, as certainly Mark Zuckerberg is, he doesn't really care about free speech. He just wants to make lots of money, mainly from showing, gossip or videos of cats playing the piano or what have you. I mean, the advertising revenue is what keeps these companies going. But if Elon Musk is prepared to take a financial hit and stand up to the British government when it seeks to usher in this new era of censorship, that's something that I would welcome. Although I have my doubts as to whether Elon Musk could really care too much about Nadine Dorries and what she intends to censor. Or even worse, and the real problem here, is the decisions that were not seen. For example, take on this SpectatorTV. This is made thanks to YouTube. If it wasn't for YouTube's technology, we wouldn't have a product. But YouTube itself has got a list of things that are legal to say, but it will not tolerate. One of those things, for example, is to say that there was some voting malfunction which made a swing state go the wrong way in the 2016 election. If you say what I have just said, and then do not follow it up with, by the way, that's wrong, or by the way, that's contentious, then YouTube will come along and censor you and take you off the air. Now, we only know about that because that's a rare example of a YouTube kind of free speech exemption clause that we're aware of. There are so many other things like that, sentences that if you say them, you will be removed from the internet. What we need is greater transparency as to what these are, because you run the risk pretty quickly of having a political debate skewed one way or another and government critics silenced. That is the problem that we're facing with the online safety bill, and we need a lot more Elon Musks to protect us from that risk.
Suzanne, I'm interested in this idea that Fraser brings up about providing blanket protection, which in this case is being given by a billionaire to ordinary folk who want to be able to say what they want to say on the internet. I mean, it could be the case that Elon Musk doesn't bog himself down in dramatically changing the algorithms of Twitter or trying to change nitty-gritty regulation, but more or less just says, I'm going to push back publicly when politicians want to crack down on social media, and that in and of itself could create change. Do you think he's going to be more of a technocrat when it comes to this, or do you think he's going to be more public, simply pushing back on this idea that speech should be censored?
You know, my guess from what we've seen of him is he'll do a bit of both. He likes to use the bully pulpit. I wouldn't be surprised if he tries to goad and provoke politicians and regulators as they wade into this realm. If he sounds off on his views on particular pieces of regulation or what he sees as overzealousness on the part of, for example, EU authorities or legislators in Washington who are contemplating some similar kinds of bills and measures. So I expect him to be part of that debate. But I think the real test and what we should hold him to is what he does himself with the platform. You know, how far is he going to go in terms of trying to really protect speech? One thing he could do very concretely, for example, is augment the appeals process on Twitter. Right now, if your content is taken down or your account is disabled, you may not get a clear answer as to why that happened, what rule you're accused of breaking. If you believe that the determination was in error, the appeals processes are cumbersome. They can take weeks. We all know the value of Twitter lies in the immediacy, the ability to get your views out in real time, to respond to something that's breaking news. And so, is Musk going to invest in augmenting those systems so that where content moderation systems are overzealous, where there are false positives, those free speech rights can be vindicated in real time? That's something concrete that he could do. When it comes to online harassment, that is an impairment of freedom of expression when people are driven off Twitter because the environment becomes so toxic and vitriolic and threatening that they feel unsafe. Is he going to take steps to address that on the platform, to give users the tools that they need to protect themselves and to continue to make their voices heard and to exercise their freedom of expression? So those are things that when he takes over this platform are going to be in his immediate hands and under his control. And I think we need to look very carefully at how he's going to approach that to push him hard to make good on what he is promising. If he is a champion of free speech, there are ways to realize that very concretely on Twitter. And, that's what I hope we see from Elon Musk. And if he falls short, I think it's the imperative of civil society, of Twitter users, to hold him accountable.
Fraser, I want to go back to the online safety bill that you were mentioning before. It sounds innocuous, but you say in this week's article that it will be one of the most ambitious censorship laws the world has ever seen. It seems like at the moment there's a very real chance that this is going to pass through Parliament. Can you tell us what that will mean for free speech in the UK?
Well, what it will mean is that there will be a new test, harmful, that if any online company publishes what a regulator might regard as harmful, they will get fined. So what you will then get is automatic censorship, which happens already, by the way. Everything we say here on YouTube, everything which is put out on Twitter or Facebook is scanned by bots. There was simply too much of it to scan for humans to scan. And there will be algorithms deciding if the subject matter is a bit too risky. Now, in theory, of course, this will stop promotion of terrorism, drug promotion, etc. That's illegal. What we will, and I as an editor, come up against all the time, minority arguments which we're making, which are falling foul of these censors. For example, we commissioned 2 academics to look at the science on face mask usage, 2 academics very respected in their field. And Facebook decided this went against the government line, and it slapped a label on it saying that this was untrue information. Now, Facebook will not respond to our emails asking why this is untrue. And this is the kind of material which could end up maybe not even published at all, because somebody, perhaps a computer, perhaps a human, we just don't know, has looked at something, has judged it to be risky, because during COVID, going against the government's line on lockdown and other things was risky, and we think, you know what, we're not going to take the risk. We're going to either put a label on it saying it's untrue, or, as happened to David Davis, MP, when he made a speech against lockdown, that was removed completely from YouTube. Now, that was a human error, it caused uproar, but that's an example of the mistakes which will be taken all the time. Now, we've also seen Novara Media, which is a very successful far-left political organisation which exists on YouTube. They were taken down for a while, again by a mistake. There was uproar, they were taken back up. We've had the Socialist Workers' Party. Their page was taken down from Facebook, again in error. But those are the kinds of things we can expect to happen a lot more regularly, but we won't know when decisions are being happened. We only know about the ones where there is uproar because it is visible. What happens if your average citizen wants to make points critical of lockdown policy, critical of the government, or saying things which a censor or a bot might regard as disfavouring whatever government regulatory regime there is? They will simply not appear. So you're going to get what appears to be a Facebook newsfeed, which is you think you're getting what all your friends are posting. In fact, what you're getting is a curated version of that, curated by a politicised formula, and the government will be calling the shots. Now, for 3 centuries in Britain, we have stopped government calling the shots over press regulation. Magazines and newspapers have fought successfully to defend their independence, and that's for basic democratic reasons. You do not want to have a media where the government sits at the top regulating it, but that's exactly what we're getting with digital. When the online safety bill has come along, then you're going to get the online world operating under an apparatus decided by politicians, with judgments made by a government-appointed regulator, a regulator who can himself be overruled by the government. I'm not a fan of political control of free speech. I think we've fought for a long time to prevent it, but Britain is the first country to sleepwalk into it, and I think the repercussions are going to be pretty big, especially when regimes like Turkey see what we've done here and replicate it over there. We're about to lose something very precious, I think, and it's quite depressing to think that characters like Elon Musk might be our only hope of defence.
Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, has found himself in a fight with Disney. When DeSantis introduced legislation that would limit what young kids would be taught about sex and gender, the corporation announced that it would push for the law to be repealed or struck down in the courts. DeSantis hit back, rescinding a special tax status that Disney's Orlando resort has had for the past 50 years. Is he going too far? I'm joined now by Freddy Gray, the Spectator's deputy editor, and Charlie Cooke, a senior writer at the National Review magazine. Freddy, you write for this week's magazine about Florida Governor Ron DeSantis' fight with Disney. Can you break down exactly what's happened for Spectator TV viewers?
Well, it's quite a twisty, turny story, but I'll do my best. I think it speaks to a growing phenomenon in America, which is, if you want, woke corporate America fighting against Republican and quite hardened bruiser Republican governors and legislators. And the Disney story is a very good example of this. And to understand it, you have to go back to the so-called Don't Say Gay bill, which was a bill introduced by Ron DeSantis, which essentially was very fair and sensible. And I think I can say that neutrally, because all it did was ensure parents had more authority over teachers, over what their children are taught about sex and gender. And DeSantis picked this issue cleverly because it sent progressives into a sort of frenzy, a real fit of apoplexy. And Disney was dragged into this because the former CEO of Disney, Bob Iger, decided to tweet and go on CNN about it and say that it was outrageous. And he forced the current CEO, Bob Chapek, to issue a statement saying that Disney will do what it can to fight this law that had actually passed. And so Ron DeSantis took that as an act of aggression, and he responded, Charlie can correct me if I'm getting this wrong, and he responded by passing a law with withdrawing Disney's special district status in Florida. And that is a special district status that there are lots of them all over America, but it meant that this enormous Disney World near Orlando in Florida had its tax status withdrawn, or might have its tax status withdrawn, and Disney saves millions of dollars every year through this special district, and it may have to pay millions in tax and lose lots of special privileges as a result of this special district status. So I hope that's not too twisty, but that was the fight, and it's a very sort of interesting fight because it speaks to what happens when increasingly aggressive, radical Republican politicians on the right get into fights with woke corporate America, and how that plays into politics is really interesting, and it's causing divisions on the right, which I think Charlie can tell us more about.
Charlie, first, do you agree or disagree with Freddy's analysis of the Don't Say Gay bill and that it's fair and neutral, what he described? And second, what did you make of what Ron DeSantis has decided to do with Disney?
So yes, I like the bill. Don't say gay is a pejorative way of describing it, an inaccurate way of describing it that a lot of left-wing agitators have used and succeeded in using. I mean, this is now the standard way that the bill is talked about in the press. It doesn't, of course, say anything of the sort. If it did, I would oppose it. What it says is that instruction for children in public schools in Florida between kindergarten and third grade, so we're talking very young here, 5, 6, 7, must be age appropriate. And this is an attempt to push back against some of the real attempts to include in curricula gender ideology. Critics have said, well, it will stop a teacher who is gay and married to someone of the same sex from mentioning their husband or their wife. It doesn't. And the guidelines that Florida put out showed that it doesn't. And that's why it's very popular. It's popular not only among Floridians, it's popular among Democrats in Florida, Democrat primary voters in Florida, some of the most politically engaged. So this law should not have been as controversial as it has been, and one of the reasons that it has been is it's just been misdescribed, as happens a lot in politics, obviously. My objection is to this secondary move. I've got a lot of emails from people on the right who've said, why don't you want to fight? Why do you hate Ron DeSantis? I don't. I'm a conservative. I live in Florida. I voted for DeSantis. I will vote for him again. He's actually been on a remarkable winning streak. He signed a 15-week abortion ban into law ahead of potential overturn of Roe v. Wade. He, in my view, got COVID pretty much exactly right. He signed this bill, the Parental Rights in Education bill, and then told its critics to pound sand. It's just that this secondary move against Disney has two big problems. First off, it's very clearly retaliatory. You shouldn't make law like this. Disney's allowed to speak up even if Disney's wrong. And pretending that this was some long-standing policy objective is preposterous. I mean, no Republican in Florida had even thought about this until about a week ago, rescinding this 50-year policy that has worked. Secondly, I just think it's a bad idea on policy grounds. The way that this has been demagogued is that this is some special treatment for Disney. But it's not really. It's a way of dealing with what is an extremely peculiar setup. I mean, Disney World is the size of San Francisco. It's twice the size of Manhattan. There's 175 miles of roads inside it. It has 44,000 hotel rooms. This isn't SeaWorld or Universal Studios or Alton Towers. This is essentially a city. And Florida has done this for a lot of strange, peculiar or unusual entities. Like Orlando Airport is an independent special district. The Villages, this sprawling retirement community, is an independent special district. The Daytona International Speedway is one. Because sometimes you just have to set up odd rules for odd entities. And I think DeSantis hasn't thought this through. I think what he's done is possibly illegal. And if it's not illegal, it's just going to take years to untangle for no discernible reason.
Yeah, Freddy, on that point, I mean, almost regardless of whether or not you support this bill, something does not sit right with the idea of government essentially using its heavy fist to come down on a company that has disagreed with it. And it's disagreed with it for, you and Charlie have put forward the argument for the bill. I'll put forward the argument against, that it is designed to limit the extent to which kids will hear the word gay or bisexual. And as well, for a Republican Party that supposedly supports school choice, should the government be getting involved at all in these kinds of questions? Surely the real answer is to say, look, parents should have more control over what their kids are taught, and they should get to choose the schools that their kids go to and what is taught there, rather than saying, we do not want you using explicit words that understandably don't sit right with many minority communities.
Well, I think the Republican Party is changing, and we might not like it, but it's just the direction it's heading in. It is heading towards picking these fights, and it's heading towards winning these fights. And even once it's won these fights, it will go further and win some more, just to humiliate its enemies. And it's ugly, and it's nasty, but it seems to be what works, and it's what people on the right think has happened to them for a long time. And that may be because they have a victim complex or something like that. But for a lot of Republican voters, it seems to be the way to win. And they like it. They like the pain that it caused. And it seems to be, particularly with social media now, it seems to be the way in which you conduct politics is not through respecting the institution, the limits, the separations of whatever powers. It's through making your enemies suffer. And that's what Ron DeSantis has done, and we have to say brilliantly. And in going further than he perhaps should have done, from a sort of a traditional conservative point of view, he also beautifully exposed how the left feel about taxes, because every single progressive American commentator started bleating about government overreach into taxation and how and seemed to be an enemy of governments taking some power back from corporations on taxation, and that shows to a lot of Republican voters that they are not sincere when they oppose evil corporations. It's just the evil corporations that aren't on their side that they oppose. So it's clever politics, even if we don't like it, and it works.
Charlie, we are living in strange times where you have the progressive left defending a corporation like Disney, which in many other circumstances you would expect to see them shouting about. And you have one of the most famous Republicans right now, tipped certainly to be a contender for the next presidential election, to be using the powers of the state to crack down on a company that has said things that this particular politician doesn't like.
Yeah. Before I get to that, I would just provide a quick counter argument to your point about charter schools or government setting school curricula. I mean, I'm a big advocate of charter schools. Florida's increased its charter school cash by quite a lot in the last 4 years. But public schools are going to set curricula. I mean, they are going to be set by voters. They're either going to be set at the state level or they're going to be set at the school board level. We can't escape that. And so after a certain point, it becomes what the curricula should be, whether it's good or bad, whether this move is favorable or unfavorable. I don't think you could have every charter school in the world, but as long as you have some public school system, that's going to come up. On the Disney side, though, it's not necessarily going to come up. So the argument that Disney would make is that it is being retaliated against, and that under the First Amendment to the US Constitution, that is illegal. There are a number of Supreme Court cases over the years that have held that even contracts that don't have to be offered, even tax breaks that don't have to be offered, even special statuses that don't have to be offered, are subject to First Amendment review. There's a famous case from 1996 in which a guy who owned a truck company, I believe in Chicago, was denied the renewal of his contract because he had favored the opposing party in the election. And so when the guy who actually won came in, he said, right, we're not renewing your contract. And the Supreme Court said, well, you can't do that. I'm not sure that was right as a decision. The dissent from Scalia and Clarence Thomas is pretty good. But that is the law. And so Disney would say, look, you cannot discriminate against us if it is obvious that you're doing it for political reasons. What Florida would say is, well, no, this isn't really retaliating. We haven't raised your tax rate or shut you down or, sent tanks in. What we've done here is declined to renew a special perk that you get because it's no longer in the public interest. I don't know how that would work out in the courts. I think it would be a very interesting case to watch. I just think that it is so abundantly obvious that what has happened here is that DeSantis has become angry with Disney for saying it's going to overturn this law or have it fought in the courts. And then he has picked on a weakness that Disney has in the government system. I mean, again, no one mentioned this until a few days ago. It's true that Disney doesn't have a right to its special district, but it didn't have a right to its special district when it was created in 1967 or in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000, 2010, until now. It's never had a right to it, and no one has ever thought that it was a bad idea. This is not some issue that comes up at cocktail parties in Florida. So, even if DeSantis can get away with this legally, which maybe he can, I don't know, this is a really bad precedent to set, in my view. And it's something you would much more associate with progressives who try to do this all the time.
It's another form of cancellation, I suppose. Freddy, you spoke before about the emergence of a new Republican Party, one that I would argue reflects more of the Donald Trump style, which DeSantis seems to be tapping into, again, potentially indicating some hope of presidential ambitions there. What does it mean for the Republican Party if someone like Ron DeSantis is representative of what it now believes?
Well, I don't know entirely what it means. I think Trump was this aberration, and as has been said many times before, the party is now dominated by the Trumpist movement. It isn't entirely dominated by the Trumpist movement, and politicians have to be clever. They can't just ape Trump. But DeSantis did ape Trump, but it's a sort of cleverer version in many ways. And what I say in the piece is that almost the art of Trump, and perhaps it was the cleverest part of Trump, but I don't think so, is that you always had this sense he didn't really know what he was doing. You were never sure whether he had any idea what he was doing. With DeSantis, I think you feel he does know what he's doing, and he's very deliberately picking these fights. He's trolling his enemies, and then he's making them suffer. And people like it. It's a form of politics that the Republican Party is getting quite good at. Picking fights with woke corporations or whatever it is, woke institutions, Major League Baseball in Georgia, and proving itself to be on the side of the majority, and then making corporations backtrack. And they're not bad at it, and it's not a bad way of winning support and elections. Again, I stress it's not how politics perhaps should be done, but I think it's where we're going.
And it seems, Charlie, we've been going there for some time. What do you make of all of this? It is disheartening, to say the least, to conservatives and I think small L liberals as well, to see that the Republican Party now is embracing using the state and using it in a pretty aggressive way when it suits them. I think one of Trump's arguments during his time in office is that the left have been doing this for some time, so the right may as well do it too. But now you have the two major parties in the states happy to use government to forward its own agenda. And I guess people who are, in a political tribe will feel like they're benefiting from that from time to time. But do you think the average American voter is going to benefit from that overall?
Well, I don't think anyone will benefit if this descends into some Hobbesian fight of all against all. No. I would put DeSantis in context here and say, I am not usually invited on TV shows or podcasts to criticize him. And one of the reasons for that is that although superficially DeSantis has exhibited some Trump characteristics, most notably his bellicosity and willingness to call out journalists or to give press conferences where he is blunt. He has been in the mainstream of historical modern American conservatism as governor of Florida. And the guy started as a Tea Party guy, and then he was in the House Freedom Caucus in Congress. And as governor of Florida, he's been a low tax, low regulation, mostly business friendly, anti-illegal immigration, pro-immigrant, mainstream Republican governor who is pro-life and believes in school choice. And this is the first moment where he has taken off the gloves and actually done something outside of that mold. So we ought to be careful not to cast him as too much of a Trump figure, because he's not. But I think what worries me about this, and what should worry Americans about this, is that this was ill thought through. I don't necessarily think it will hurt him, and I take Freddy's point about this being sometimes an effective tactic. But one of the things that I have liked about Ron DeSantis as the governor of Florida is that he's been thoughtful and well-read. With COVID, the left portrayed him as this wild-eyed ideologue who was pretending that COVID didn't matter. It's just not true. In fact, if you watch interviews with DeSantis, you'll see he's read all the medical literature. He knew the statistics. He knew the names of the drugs and what they did and what the clinical trials had said. You might dislike his conclusions, but he wasn't Trump talking about, injecting bleach into your skin. And everything he's done, even the moves that I haven't agreed with, seems to have been considered. And I don't think this was. Already we're seeing lawyers, tax experts, accountants come out and say, this is an intractable mess. It's going to be struck down. He's created a real headache for himself, and so on and so forth. That's the Trumpy bit. We all watched Trump for 4 years. He would just say anything. And that side of this alarms me, because it seems to me that a bit like Joe Biden has done from the other side, DeSantis got carried away and forgot that Twitter is not the real world, and that pleasing people on Twitter often doesn't translate particularly well into public policy.
But Charlie, if I may, it's not the first time he's sort of overreached conspicuously, is it? I mean, there was that anti-riot bill. You'll know more about this than me, but he wanted to put in, or he seemed to want to put in, provisions suggesting that drivers could run their cars into protesters if the riot was, they would have civil immunity, I think, and then that people could face racketeering charges if the organisers of a peaceful protest, if that protest turned violent. These bits got taken out of the bill, so he had to backtrack. But of course, in doing so, even when he loses, he wins, which again with Disney could be the same thing, because fundamentally what voters care about is their children. A lot of voters with children care about their children, and the vast majority are with him, not Disney, on this. So even if he fails tactically, he wins on the issue.
That's the last question I wanted to put to both of you. In DeSantis versus Disney, who do you think has won? Freddy?
DeSantis, I think.
Charlie?
Well, I think in terms of the public perception of it, DeSantis will win. And part of the reason for that is that Disney is opposing a bill that is popular and got caught, its employees got caught on video saying insane things, which is the other part of this. I think in DeSantis v. Disney, as a legal matter, as a public policy matter in Florida, I think Disney will prevail because this was ill thought through.
Freddie and Charlie, thanks for joining me. And finally, I've written for this week's magazine about how I've been an arachnophobe my whole life. Tired of being so frightened by even a photo of a spider, I decided to undergo the London Zoo's Friendly Spider program, which boasts being able to reduce or even eliminate one's fear of spiders in just one afternoon. And I'm joined now by Dave Clarke, the head keeper of invertebrates at the zoo and the Friendly Spider program course leader, who I did the course with just a few weeks ago. Dave, thanks for joining me on Spectator TV, and I have to say, it's nice to see you here because we last met a few weeks ago and you met me on probably one of the most vulnerable and nerve-wracking days I can say I've had in a very, very long time. I came to the London Zoo to take part in the Friendly Spider program, and in the course of an afternoon, I know that there are lots of different techniques you use, but frankly I think it's magic because a lifelong arachnophobe who ranked her fear at a 10 managed to catch a house spider by the end of the day.
Well done for a start, because we're very proud of all the people who go through our course, and we know it's not easy, and you're quite right, it's very stressful and intense to do it, also to build yourself up to do it, but we're very proud of people facing their fears and coming onto the course.
Well, Dave, tell me a bit about the course, because you've been running it for many years now. It had to take a pause during the pandemic. The course I did was actually the first one back since the pandemic hit. There are about 40 of us, and your success rate is something like 90%. How do you make that happen?
Well, it's a combination of techniques. That's the main thing. So the two key ones are cognitive therapy, so it's knowledge about spiders, and hypnosis. And the hypnosis helps us do it within the course of one afternoon. So as you know, it was within about 3-4 hours, we'd been able to turn people from sometimes lifelong arachnophobes into people who can cope, and hopefully in some cases, well done, to get them to actually love spiders as well. I don't know if we were there with you yet
Not
on
yet.
that, but that's certainly something that I prefer to try and do with people as well. So what it starts with knowledge about the phobia itself. What is it that sets you off? What, where, when, why, basically, and then that comes from our hypnotherapist, John Clifford, and then I kind of answer those questions from a spider expert's point of view of whether they can or can't do these things, and what the science is basically behind those things that happen. So why are they coming inside the house, for example? Are they really dangerous? All those things. And then we have a short tea break, which is actually quite important. Group therapy as well, these things. That's particularly why we couldn't do it during the pandemic, because it's a close contact thing, really, with everybody working together on this. And then we have a short hypnosis session, which is vitally important. And then we go over to our spider exhibit in with the spiders inside London Zoo, and you get to meet the spiders, so find out whether you've got over your fear. And as you know, everybody on that course managed to get their certificate for catching up a house spider, so it was 100%, which is a lovely start to the year for us.
It was incredible, because there were people at the start of the course who were crying, who were sitting in their seats during the lecture in tears. And then they were not just catching house spiders, they were holding a friendly Mexican red knee, which we'll come on to. But I wanted to hear a bit from you about the group dynamic, because I remember you telling me at the start of the program that you did offer individual sessions, but they often weren't as successful, that the group mattered. And I could almost immediately see why, because one of my favorite parts of the program was us all yelling out what we disliked about spiders. There was an immediate camaraderie that was building up. And by the time we got to the Tiny Giants exhibition, there were deep friendships with people whose names I didn't know. People saying to me, you know, if I see you do it, maybe I can do it. And me saying, gosh, if I watch you do that, maybe I can do that. And I could tell that perhaps I would have been much more fearful and less willing to put myself forward if I hadn't been in that group dynamic.
Yeah, I'm glad you picked up on that, because it is a very important part of the course. So in the past, and we have been doing this course since 1993, we've done the odd single treatment, but you're right, or small groups, and it's never as successful as doing a big group at once. And there is a maximum number as well. I mean, we never normally go over, say, 50 people, because it sounds like a lot, but you're right, there is that bonding between people, and we do encourage everybody to have a spider buddy for the afternoon, and they're the ones that you initially share your experiences with, and it is a very valuable part of the way in which we do it. And like I said, that tea break's important, because that's a chance for everybody to sort of relax a little bit just amongst yourselves. Me and my colleague Jamie, who are the spider people, are there to answer any technical questions, but generally everybody's just having a chat and sort of seeing how they're getting on.
So I'm going to warn viewers now that if you were like me a few weeks ago and couldn't even see a spider, a photo, a video, anything without freaking out, you are going to start to see some photos pop up, including one of me holding Carol, the friendly Mexican red knee, who I guess would crassly be known as a tarantula. And Dave has also brought a smaller but significant friend who I had to catch in order to get my certificate. Dave, you've brought a house spider with you, so we'll pull her up. And I amazingly don't think I'm going to scream. There she is. There she is. They're
so that's a good size
big,
house
Dave.
spider. And this is
Tell
the
us about
typical
her.
spider that everybody's got to be able to deal with when they are at home. So the red-kneed spider, you mentioned the tarantula spider, as it were, that's sort of icing on the cake. And just a bit of where those big spiders are actually, it's possible to hold one in your hand, they'll just sit there. Whereas these little house spiders, we demonstrated to you, didn't we, that actually they don't want to come on our hands. They can sense the heat from our hands, and so will avoid human contact. And we are very careful with the spiders, by the way. We think of their welfare as well. They get lots of downtime after doing the friendly spider course. And some of them are released back into the wild afterwards as well. This
really?
little
Clear.
thing. Sorry.
It was very clear that no spider was harmed during the program. They were nice participants. But it was really interesting to me that I'm going to be completely honest, Dave, and I know this is going to upset you and upset you during the course. When you originally asked us how we usually deal with them, almost everybody admitted that it ends in death. It's either your death or theirs, and you kill the spider, you take the shoe, you hit it. And by the time we got to catching the
Of
house
course,
spider,
just to reiterate, it's never going to be your death.
it's never going to be your death,
not
because
in
as we
reality.
learned in the course,
Yeah.
spiders aren't going to harm you. But that's how you feel, right? You feel like it's a fight to the death. And I have to say,
It's
by the
them
time
or us, kind of thing.
yeah, by the time I was catching the house spider, I'm going to level with you. I didn't think it was cute. I don't think it's pretty. It still kind of grosses me out. But as I was catching it, I felt bad for the medium-sized guy. I mean, house spiders aren't small, but something had changed. I kind of knew what the power dynamic was now. And it allowed me to catch it in a safe way for the spider, and also to not result in, a full-blown panic attack.
Great, that's really good. And we often name the spiders during that course. I think there was a male called George who was there on the evening, and that helps people empathise with them as individual living creatures as well. But a big part of people's fear or misunderstanding, let's call it, of spiders is that they seem so alien and different to us, but they are just another species of animal as much as we are, and deserve respect as much as anything else. They're just really different. And as I may have said during the course, to me, that's what makes them fascinating, that they're different. And we do embrace diversity much more these days as humans, and so we should embrace animal diversity as well.
Well, I'm never going to forget Carol's name, the tarantula, and I was really terrified. We took it very slow. I remember petting her back leg, and you said, "How does it feel?" And I said, "Horrible." And you said, "No, Kate, honestly, how does it feel?" And I have to admit, it was very silky soft. The experience ended up being a really positive one. So Dave, I owe you a lot. Thank you for helping me to downgrade my fear from about a 10 to a 5. And I would highly recommend the course. So I hope you're able to cure a lot more arachnophobes in the near future.
Great, thank you. And we do take records of what people's fear levels were before and after the course. And I can tell you that the average on that course was going from an 8 to a 4. So we are on average halving someone's fear of spiders. And once we have someone under a level of 5, we consider that they're not really phobic anymore. So we're actually putting together a lot of this data for a paper very soon.
Oh, fantastic. Well, look out for that. Well, Dave, thanks for joining me. That's it for this week. Once again, don't forget to subscribe to the Spectator's YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. Thanks for watching, and do join us again next week.